4 million barrels. That is how much Canadian crude oil crosses into the United States every single day, quietly, continuously, feeding refineries from the Gulf Coast to the American Midwest, even as Washington and Ottawa spent the past several weeks hurling 50% tariffs, personal insults, and outright threats of economic subordination at each other across nearly every other corner of this relationship. While Donald Trump was posting that Canada needed to fall in line or face consequences far worse than what it had already imposed, while Ontario's premier was telling the American president he could kiss his ass, while an entire trade relationship was collapsing in public in ways nobody expected, one thing never stopped moving across that border: oil. And the moment you understand why that oil kept flowing untouched while nearly everything else got hit, you understand something. Washington itself has been very careful never to say out loud that Canada's energy leverage did not need to be used as a weapon to already be shaping the outcome of this entire fight. To understand exactly how central this oil question has become to a trade war that, on the surface, looks like it is entirely about cars, dairy, and steel, you have to go back to the exact moment Trump signed the tariffs that triggered this whole confrontation. On July 20th, 2026, he signed 3 presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a statute so obscure and so rarely touched that no American president had used it to actually impose tariffs since 1949. The proclamations placed a 50% duty on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, dairy products, alcoholic beverages, motor vehicles, and dozens of secondary categories: wine, cement, clothing, furniture, hockey equipment, all of it. And buried inside the fine print of those proclamations sat a detail that almost nobody outside the trade policy world paid much attention to at the time: a specific, deliberate list of exemptions. Energy products, oil, gas, and electricity were explicitly carved out. So was potash. So were critical minerals. So was fish and seafood. Everything else was fair game. Those 4 categories were not. That exemption did not happen by accident, and it did not happen out of generosity. It happened because Washington's own trade officials understood something that has quietly shaped every single stage of this dispute since, that touching Canadian energy exports would inflict immediate, visible, and politically explosive pain on the American side of the border, the exact opposite of what a punitive tariff campaign is supposed to accomplish. Roughly 3/4 of all the heavy crude oil the United States imports comes from Canada. Canadian barrels make up close to 1/4 of everything American refineries actually process on a given day. In the Midwest specifically, refiners lean on Canadian crude for something close to 70% of their total supply. These are not abstract statistics sitting in a government report somewhere. These are the refineries in Illinois, in Indiana, in Ohio, engineered and calibrated over decades specifically to run the heavy, sour crude that flows south from Alberta. Refineries that cannot simply switch to a different grade of oil overnight without billions of dollars in retrofits and years of lead time. Touch that supply chain, even briefly, and the pain shows up almost immediately at American gas pumps, not months later in some abstract economic indicator nobody notices. If you have been following every twist of this standoff and are wondering why, in the middle of an escalating trade war that has included personal insults between a sitting president and a provincial premier, oil has somehow remained the one subject both sides keep circling around rather than actually fighting over directly, this is exactly the detail worth sitting with, because it explains far more about the actual balance of power in this relationship than any of the headline tariff percentages do. Here is where Carney's own public handling of this exact question becomes genuinely revealing, because his approach has been careful in a way that says almost as much as an outright threat would have. Back in late July, weeks before this dispute reached its current boiling point, Carney was asked directly, twice at a housing announcement in Red Deer, Alberta, whether Canada might consider holding back energy exports as leverage in these negotiations. His answer, both times, was deliberately restrained. "Being a reliable supplier is important," he said. "Canadians are reliable. Canadians can be trusted." And then, when pressed specifically on whether Alberta oil could be used as a bargaining chip, he added a line that has aged into one of the more quietly consequential statements of this entire dispute. "When you are a supplier of a key commodity, a key service, you have got to think really hard about not supplying it," he said. "I do not see the value of it." On its face, that sounds like Carney closing the door on using oil as a weapon entirely. Listen more closely, and it is actually something considerably more strategic. He did not say Canada would never withhold energy exports under any circumstances. He said he personally did not currently see the value in doing so, a carefully hedged formulation that leaves the option technically alive while signaling, for now, that Canada intends to keep behaving like a reliable supplier rather than an unpredictable one. That distinction matters enormously because reliability itself is a form of leverage in a relationship this deeply integrated. A supplier who has spent decades proving dependable and who publicly declines to weaponize that dependability even when directly provoked sends a signal considerably harder for the other side to simply dismiss than an explicit threat would. It tells Washington, without ever saying it outright, that the moment Canada's calculation changes, the consequences would be immediate, and the credibility behind that shift would be unusually high, precisely because Ottawa had been so restrained about it up to that point. That restraint has not been universal across Canada's own political landscape, and the contrast between different Canadian voices on this exact question tells you a great deal about how seriously everyone involved actually takes the stakes. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, whose province produces the overwhelming majority of Canada's oil exports, has been the most emphatic voice arguing against ever going down this road. She has said she cannot think of a more disastrous policy decision than cutting off or taxing Alberta crude exports to the United States, warning it could devastate Canada's own economy long before it meaningfully damaged Washington's. That is not a small caveat. Alberta's entire provincial economy is built around energy exports, and Smith's political survival depends heavily on keeping that pipeline, literally and figuratively, running smoothly. But even inside Alberta's own conservative political tradition, that view is not universal. Jason Kenney, the province's former premier, has argued publicly that Canada should not rule out export taxes on oil, fuel, or potash if Trump continues escalating. His reasoning is worth quoting directly because it captures precisely the kind of asymmetric political pressure this specific form of leverage could apply if Ottawa ever chose to use it. Such retaliation, Kenney said, would affect Republicans who drive F-150s and lay fertilizer on their farm fields. He added a pointed warning aimed squarely at the political calendar. If Washington really wants to escalate, he said, it will not end well for the American economy 2 months before the midterm elections. That timing detail is not incidental. It is precisely why oil sits at the center of every calculation both governments are quietly making right now. Because unlike dairy tariffs or auto duties, which land unevenly across specific industries and specific consumer categories, a disruption to Canadian crude flows would touch gas prices directly, immediately, and visibly, in exactly the kind of way that shows up on a voter's receipt weeks before they head to the polls. Doug Ford, never one to understate a threat once he has decided to make one, has placed oil explicitly on his own growing list of escalation options if Washington keeps pushing this dispute further, alongside electricity and critical minerals, both of which Ontario genuinely controls and has already partially weaponized earlier in this standoff through a 25% surcharge on power exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. Ford has said Canada should consider increasingly severe retaliation targeting oil specifically if Trump continues going after Canadian industries. That is a notably different posture from Carney's careful hedging, and it reflects the broader pattern that has defined this dispute since talks collapsed entirely late last Friday night. Ford consistently willing to name the most aggressive option out loud in front of television cameras, Carney consistently more measured in public while presumably keeping every option genuinely open behind closed doors. A division of political labor that has, whether by design or coincidence, given Ottawa the benefit of both a visible hardliner and a more diplomatically restrained head of government, simultaneously representing the same underlying national position. There is a reason this specific tension between restraint and escalation matters so much right now, and it traces directly back to how badly the most recent round of negotiations actually fell apart. A collapse that has already reshaped how seriously both governments are treating every remaining piece of leverage still sitting on the table. Trade talks that both governments had described as very close to a resolution collapsed late Friday night, with Carney suspending negotiations entirely and ordering his trade team back to Ottawa. The 50% tariffs took effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, hitting roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods exactly as originally scheduled. Carney did not soften his account of what happened. "You are at war when you get attacked," he told reporters afterward. "We got attacked." He confirmed Canada would match Washington's tariffs dollar for dollar with retaliation beginning September 8th, and told his own premiers he was designing a support package for affected industries built to last as long as necessary, potentially for the remainder of Trump's entire term if the standoff persists that long. Then on Monday, rather than seeking any path back toward the table, Trump escalated again, posting that Canada needed to fall in line or face consequences he described as far worse than what had already been imposed, while simultaneously threatening to double tariffs on Canadian autos, auto parts, and steel to 50%, starting January 1st, 2027. Carney's response was equally direct, accusing Washington of trying to subordinate Canada and rejecting outright what he called an attitude at the negotiating table that treats Canada as a subsidiary of the United States. Ford, appearing alongside that exchange, revealed a detail that helps explain exactly why the original negotiation collapsed as badly as it did, saying he understood Washington had sought language in the final days of talks that would have restricted Canada's ability to negotiate trade agreements with other countries without American approval, a demand Carney has since called an unacceptable violation of Canadian sovereignty. Against that backdrop of escalating tariffs, escalating rhetoric, and now an explicit demand touching Canada's basic sovereignty over its own foreign trade policy, the fact that oil has still, even now, not been formally weaponized by either side stands out as genuinely significant. Trump himself has flirted publicly with the idea of eventually including oil in his tariff campaign. In the earliest rounds of this broader dispute, well before Section 338 ever entered the picture, he said he expected to decide whether sweeping tariffs would apply to Canadian oil imports specifically, adding that it depended on whether energy imports were, in his words, priced properly. He ultimately chose not to include it, and when the current round of Section 338 tariffs went live this past Saturday, energy again sat explicitly outside the list of covered goods, alongside potash, critical minerals, and seafood, exactly the same categories Washington had quietly protected from the very beginning of this entire confrontation back in July. That pattern, energy consistently exempted across multiple separate rounds of escalation, month after month, tariff proclamation after tariff proclamation, is not a coincidence, and it is not simply an oversight. It is the clearest available evidence of where the genuine structural leverage in this relationship actually sits, evidence that speaks louder than any public statement either government has made. Washington has shown itself willing to tariff wine, hockey sticks, dairy, cars, steel, and dozens of other categories, willing to threaten doubling those duties again next year, willing to demand language that would functionally subordinate Canada's own trade sovereignty. But it has not touched the 4 million barrels crossing the border every single day, because doing so would be, in the words of one energy analyst tracking this dispute, the one thing America genuinely could not tariff without inflicting immediate, visible harm on itself in a way none of the other measures come close to matching. There is an irony sitting inside this entire dynamic that Trump himself has never publicly acknowledged, and it is worth spelling out clearly, because it undercuts one of the central arguments he has repeated throughout this dispute. Trump has consistently cited America's trade deficit with Canada as evidence of being taken advantage of, framing the imbalance as proof that Canada benefits unfairly from this relationship. But that deficit is driven overwhelmingly by exactly the crude oil imports his own tariffs have carefully avoided touching. Exclude Canadian oil from the calculation entirely, and the United States would actually run a trade surplus with Canada, not a deficit. The very commodity underpinning the grievance Trump keeps citing publicly is the same commodity his own administration has gone out of its way, across multiple separate rounds of escalation, to leave completely untouched, because touching it would immediately reduce American refining capacity and drive up costs for American consumers in a way no amount of political messaging could easily paper over. It's also worth understanding what actually happens to the broader confrontation once you account for how much of Canada's genuine leverage remains deliberately unused rather than fully deployed. Canada's retaliatory tariff list, released in full detail by the Department of Finance, covering roughly $27.6 billion of American goods, with rates matched precisely to Washington's own 50, 25, and 15% categories, notably mirrors Washington's own restraint. Oil, gas, potash, and critical minerals are carved out of Canada's counter-tariffs too, just as they were carved out of America's original proclamations. That symmetry is not accidental either. Both governments, even in the middle of what Carney himself has now explicitly described as an economic attack, are quietly preserving the one category of trade neither side actually wants to touch, because both sides understand that once energy genuinely enters this fight, the entire character of the confrontation changes from a painful but manageable trade dispute into something considerably closer to the kind of mutually destructive economic warfare neither government has shown any appetite to actually wage. This is where Carney's earlier caution starts to look less like weakness and more like calculated positioning. By publicly declining to threaten energy exports, even while Washington was actively imposing 50% tariffs on nearly everything else, Carney kept Canada's most consequential form of leverage entirely uncommitted, unused, and therefore maximally credible, if circumstances ever genuinely required it. A threat that has already been made and walked back loses value. A threat that has never been made, delivered by a government that has spent months demonstrating restraint even under direct provocation, retains its full weight the moment it is finally deployed. Kenny's warning about the midterm elections, about Republicans driving trucks and farming fields feeling the pain of any genuine energy retaliation, sits there quietly in the background of this entire dispute, unused but fully understood by both sides, a reminder that Canada's actual capacity to inflict real pain on the American economy extends considerably further than the current round of dairy and steel tariffs suggests, should this standoff ever reach the point where Ottawa concludes the cost of restraint has finally exceeded the cost of escalation. There is also a legal and structural dimension worth understanding here, because it shapes how durable this current arrangement of mutual restraint on energy actually is going forward. Section 338, the statute behind the tariffs, now in effect, requires no formal investigation and sets no built-in limit on how the White House chooses to expand or narrow its scope over time. That means the current energy exemption exists entirely at Washington's discretion, not because of any binding legal protection written into USMCA or any other trade agreement, a detail that makes Canada's restraint around its own energy leverage feel less like a permanent policy and more like a carefully maintained equilibrium that could shift the moment either government recalculates the costs and benefits involved. If Washington ever decided the political cost of leaving oil untouched had become less painful than the economic pressure of continuing to exempt it, that exemption could disappear as unilaterally as it was granted in the first place. And if Ottawa ever concluded that restraint was no longer producing enough leverage of its own, Carney's carefully hedged language from Red Deer, "I do not see the value of it right now," leaves him every bit of room needed to reverse course without having to explain away a broken promise. There's also a currency and markets dimension worth understanding here, because professional traders have been watching this specific energy question far more closely than the day-to-day tariff headlines might suggest. The Canadian dollar has already absorbed a series of sharp moves since talks collapsed late last Friday, sliding toward roughly $1.38 against the US dollar as the broader standoff has deepened. But currency desks and commodity analysts have been explicit that a genuine disruption to oil flows would represent an entirely different category of shock compared to the tariffs currently in effect. Canadian crude prices and the shares of the country's major energy producers have, so far, largely held steady through this entire dispute, reflecting the market's own judgment that energy remains the one category unlikely to actually get touched, regardless of how personal and how public the rest of this fight becomes. That relative calm in energy markets, even as broader Canadian equities and the loonie itself absorb real pressure from the tariffs already in place, is itself a form of evidence, a signal that sophisticated market participants are pricing in exactly the same read on this situation that Carney's careful public language implies, that oil sits in a fundamentally different category from everything else caught up in this confrontation. It is also worth understanding just how directly this energy standoff, even in its current unweaponized form, touches specific American communities and specific industries making real decisions right now. Midwest refiners, who depend on Canadian heavy crude for roughly 70% of their supply, have spent the past several weeks watching this dispute escalate with a particular kind of anxiety that companies exposed to the dairy or steel tariffs simply do not share, because their entire operational model depends on a specific grade of crude oil that cannot be easily substituted from elsewhere, not on short notice, and not without billions of dollars in retrofitting costs. Gulf Coast refineries built specifically to process heavy, sour barrels face a similar structural dependency, one that has quietly shaped how cautiously even the most aggressive voices inside the Trump administration have approached the question of whether to finally include energy in this fight. That caution has held steady across multiple separate rounds of escalation now, from the original Section 338 proclamations in July through Saturday's tariffs, actually taking effect through Monday's threat of doubled auto duties, a consistency that suggests this is not simply an oversight that could change on a whim, but a genuine structural constraint neither government has found a way around. There is a broader lesson sitting inside how this specific energy standoff has played out, one that extends well beyond the question of oil itself and speaks to how leverage actually functions in a relationship this deeply integrated. For months now, Washington's public rhetoric throughout this entire dispute has consistently implied that Canada holds essentially no meaningful leverage of its own, that a country sending the overwhelming majority of its exports south has no real alternative but eventual capitulation to whatever terms Washington ultimately demands. The persistent, carefully maintained exemption of oil, gas, potash, and critical minerals from every single round of tariffs imposed so far tells a genuinely different story, one that Washington's own actions, rather than its public statements, have quietly confirmed again and again. If Canada truly held no leverage in this relationship, there would be no reason for the White House to have carved out exactly the four categories where Canada's genuine structural advantage is strongest, categories that happen to align precisely with the sector's economists and energy analysts have identified as the ones capable of inflicting real, immediate, visible pain on the American side of this dispute. Let's talk about what a genuine energy disruption would actually mean in dollar terms, because the scale involved here dwarfs nearly every other figure that has dominated coverage of this trade war so far. 4 million barrels a day is not a marginal supply relationship that either economy could easily root around on short notice. It represents the single largest source of foreign crude oil entering the United States, larger than any other country's contribution by a significant margin, flowing through pipeline infrastructure and refinery configurations, that took decades to build and calibrate specifically around Canadian heavy crude. A genuine disruption, even a partial one, would not show up gradually in some economic indicator months later. It would show up almost immediately at American gas pumps, in exactly the kind of visible, immediate kitchen table cost that has historically proven more politically damaging to sitting administrations than almost any other category of economic pain. A lesson every White House since the 1970s oil shocks has internalized deeply, regardless of party. That historical parallel is worth sitting with directly, because it helps explain why both governments have been so consistently careful around this specific issue, even while escalating aggressively everywhere else. The 1973 oil crisis, when OPEC's coordinated production cuts and export restrictions sent global oil prices surging and triggered gas lines across the United States, remains one of the most politically consequential economic shocks in modern American history, one that reshaped energy policy, foreign policy, and domestic politics for a full generation afterward. Nobody in either government wants to be responsible for triggering anything resembling that kind of shock, particularly not months before American midterm elections, particularly not in a dispute that began over comparatively narrower grievances involving dairy quotas and auto tariffs. That shared incentive, avoiding a genuinely catastrophic escalation neither side actually wants, is precisely what has kept energy quarantined from the rest of this fight, even as nearly everything else has spiraled into open personal hostility between senior officials on both sides of the border. The domestic political dynamics inside Canada around this specific question deserve closer attention too, because they reveal genuine fault lines that complicate any simple narrative of national unity against Washington's pressure. Alberta's economy, and by extension Danielle Smith's own political survival, depends overwhelmingly on continued uninterrupted energy exports to the United States, giving her government a structural incentive to resist energy-based retaliation that other provinces, less directly exposed to any potential blowback, do not share in nearly the same way. That tension surfaced clearly in her direct public rejection of the idea, a position notably more absolute than Carney's own carefully hedged language, and considerably more absolute than Kenney's willingness from outside government to at least keep the option formally on the table. Watching how that internal Canadian debate evolves, particularly if Washington's pressure continues intensifying at the pace it has over just the past several days, will likely determine far more about whether energy ever actually enters this fight than anything Washington itself decides to do. There is also a legal dimension worth returning to here, because it shapes how much genuine control either government actually has over how long this current arrangement of mutual restraint can realistically hold. Section 338, the statute underlying the tariffs currently in effect, had sat completely dormant for 96 years before this administration revived it, only after the Supreme Court struck down Trump's far broader emergency powers tariff authority back in February 2026. Trade lawyers flagged the statute's fragility almost immediately, arguing it had likely been superseded decades ago by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974. That legal uncertainty has never been resolved through litigation, and it adds an additional layer of unpredictability to every aspect of this dispute, including the energy exemption itself, because a legal challenge that succeeds in striking down Section 338 entirely would remove the very mechanism currently protecting oil, gas, potash, and critical minerals from this specific round of tariffs, potentially forcing Washington to reconsider its approach entirely if it wanted to maintain pressure on Canada through some other, less legally fragile statutory tool. So where does this actually leave both countries as this broader standoff continues unfolding with no clear resolution in sight? Ottawa currently sees little realistic chance of new formal talks resuming before the American midterm elections in November, according to people familiar with the government's internal thinking, suggesting this dispute is likely to remain in its current tense equilibrium for a considerably longer stretch than either side's earlier public statements implied, back when a deal still seemed close, just days before everything collapsed. Carney has told his own premiers he is designing a support package for affected Canadian industries built to potentially outlast the remainder of Trump's entire term, language that signals his government is now planning for a genuinely extended confrontation, rather than a temporary disruption to be quickly resolved. And through all of that planning, through every round of escalation and counter-escalation, energy has remained the one subject both governments keep circling without actually touching, a pattern with no obvious sign of changing anytime soon, but one that both sides clearly understand could shift the entire character of this confrontation the moment either government concludes the cost of continued restraint has finally outweighed whatever benefit that restraint has provided so far. Through collapsed talks, dollar-for-dollar retaliation, threats of doubled auto tariffs, and now explicit accusations of attempted subordination, is a trade war being fought almost entirely around the one commodity both sides have quietly agreed, without ever formally agreeing to anything, not to touch. Every other sector has been fair game. Cars, dairy, alcohol, steel, aluminum, appliances, agricultural equipment, all of it caught in a rapidly escalating cycle of tariffs and counter-tariffs that shows no sign of slowing down anytime soon. Oil alone has remained untouched through every single round of this confrontation. Not because either government has run out of reasons to target it, but because both governments understand, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire dispute, exactly what would happen the moment either side actually pulled that particular trigger. That is what makes Carney's quiet, carefully worded caution back in late July so consequential in hindsight. It was never really about ruling out energy leverage. It was about preserving it, intact and fully credible, for exactly the moment this dispute might eventually require it. A moment that, given how quickly this relationship has deteriorated over just the past several weeks, no longer looks nearly as distant as it did when he first delivered that answer in Red Deer. If this breakdown helped you understand why oil has stayed so conspicuously absent from a trade war that has swallowed up nearly everything else in this relationship, consider subscribing so you catch it if that changes. And share this with anyone who has been watching the tariff headlines without realizing which commodity both governments have been quietly protecting the entire time. Drop a comment below with your own read on this. Does Canada's continued restraint on energy represent smart, disciplined strategy that keeps its strongest card in reserve? Or is it simply delaying an escalation that becomes more likely with every new threat Washington adds to this fight?